First of all, I'd like to welcome all three contributors to the House today. It is an important debate and conversation that we're having here today. And I know myself, I'm doing a report for the committee on the youth guarantee, so everything that you're saying today it will be fed into the report. So if I'm asking very specific questions and giving you like an inquisition, you'll know why. I suppose the 3 areas I'm going to touch on are the practical and operational details of the youth guarantee, the success and failures in other states, and what lessons we can learn, who was it particularly successful for, who wasn't. Then touching maybe on funding, and then what rollout needs to happen in the state. Just first of all, specifically in terms of the operational detail, looking at some of the research, I've seen that some of the failures, the cons of the programme in other states, it depended on the success of public policies, for example, the public employment service infrastructure. Do you think, I'll just try and direct it generally, and if you want to address it yourself, do you think the public employment structures here in Ireland are up to standard and are they fit for purpose to try and deal with the youth guarantee and to try to deal with the influx, and how will they need to adapt? Do you think more funding will need to be put into that, and who will actually assess the success of the public employment structures into the future? Secondly, kind of going on from that, is how do you think that the rollout of the youth guarantee in Ireland can be effectively monitored in terms of the job creation, the placement services, to make sure that it's good quality that we're implementing in Ireland, that it's not just a tick the box exercise? And do you think like the PES, the public employment services, they have the capacity to do that, or to deliver on the guarantee and to monitor that? Then I suppose we'll kind of going on to some comments in your contributions. Obviously, James Doorley, you were mentioning in terms of the youth employment figures, and you're looking at the unemployment among those, for example, educated to junior cert, those educated to primary level, and those from the disadvantaged groups. How do you think, I know you mentioned that there was a failure in Sweden and Finland to successfully kind of target the disadvantaged groups. How do you think, or how do we reach out to the youths who are further away from the labour market currently, or not traditionally on the radar of the current labour market services or the public employment services? I know you mentioned the role for youth organisations and that, and I know in the actual council recommendation on the guarantee, they say that we should define the corresponding starting point to deliver the youth guarantee for those young people. Do you think that youth organisations are that alternative starting point to the public employment services, and how exactly would you see those youth organisations and those groups kind of delivering upon that, where the PES fail? What else? Bear with me 2 seconds, just looking through my notes here. James Higgins, I mentioned you were talking about public employment services, and you're talking about the funding, and you believe that even with the 6 billion that's in the Youth Employment Initiative, and if there was matching funding, it would be insufficient to try and deal with youth unemployment on the European scale. How do you think that needs to be addressed? How do you think we start actually taking it? Because there is a danger that it could just be, a flash in the pan, right, we're going to deal with youth unemployment, here's a bit of money, we're not going to match it. Like, how do you think we can make sure it's not a damp squib, essentially? Where do you think that funding can come from? And indeed, do you believe, what kind of financial commitment do you think the Irish government need to make to actually roll out this, and even what kind of schemes do you think the government need to roll out as part of that? So I'll just leave my contributions to that. I think I'm really interested in the practical and the operational details, if you have any, on the particular failures of the other schemes that have been rolled out in other states, and what exactly we can learn from that.
Thank you, Senator. Deputy Joe Riley.
Thank you very much, Chair. And could I join with my colleague Senator Catherine Riley in welcoming our three guests, and thanking you for your contributions. As a general point at the outset, I would say that our macroeconomic strategies in the country are working to the extent that what was the hemorrhage of 275,000 jobs over a 3-year period up until 2011 has been replaced by a very small increase in job numbers, but still it's indicative and tentative and welcome. 12,500 new jobs last year. So I think that's good. I still think we have, and it's something that I've been saying at this committee on many occasions, we have a crisis with youth unemployment, and I acknowledge that, and it challenges all of us. A 30% youth unemployment rate is not acceptable. Just on to raise a couple of specifics, which are the drop in the register, in the live register to 68,361 from 91,646 is obviously welcome, but I'd just be interested in Mr. Stokes' reference to the live register. To where do you see the explanation for that? Presumably some of it is in new jobs, in educational and training opportunities. I understood emigration, while remaining too high, to have somewhat stabilised, and I understood it and to be in a slight decline. So it can't be explained fully by emigration. Maybe you would, some of you would explain to us how you interpret that new change in the live register. On apprenticeships, I have recognised that the construction industry is in a very bad place now, and we all know that. But many of us would argue, and indeed I'd be aware, and we all are aware, in fact Senator Riley and myself would be aware, out of a couple of schools that were both campaigning to have built. There is still infrastructure to be developed in the country. But there's a problem, I know, with the construction sector, but having said that, I think apprenticeships are important. And I was going to ask you, is enough being done to simulate apprenticeship conditions within schools and colleges and training centres? In other words, to create the conditions where, because it's not possible now for young people to get apprenticeships. And I think it's good that a person does an apprenticeship. I mean, you might say, well, what's the point in qualifying to be a bricklayer or a carpenter or a plumber in the present conditions, or an electrician? I think still, if a person has an aspiration and a capacity in that area, it's a building point. So I would ask you about the possibility of creating, or do you think enough has been done, or what do you know about what's been done to simulate apprenticeship conditions to avoid people having to go on a treasure hunt looking for apprenticeship? And that tends to be like the jobs in Guinness as long ago that went from father to son, so it's impossible to get apprenticeships. IT is something I was preparing a speech a few weeks ago to deliver in the House in relation to one, or I forget the issue now, but I remember coming across the fact that we have a great dearth of IT people. Do you know that the IT sector tell us that is it 4,800 vacancies or whatever, a very large number of vacancies exist in the IT sector which we don't have a domestic capacity to fill, and this seems to be replicated particularly in Germany and a number of European countries. My question to you is this: do you think we're doing enough about IT, but more particularly, is there a career path? You know, the way you identify, and you're right, the long-term unemployed within the youth sector as a real problem, and it challenges us most in the sense that they're the most in need and whatever. But the lowly educated and the long-term unemployed, can they go on a ladder to train for IT? Are there jobs at that level in IT, or are all the jobs in IT sort of graduate jobs that postgraduate qualifications would prepare you for? In other words, what I'm taking up, if a young lad, and you're right in applauding Youthreach, we have a very good Youthreach centres at home, and say a young fellow or woman, a young person comes out of a Youthreach centre, 17, 18, 20, whatever, and they have minimum low level of educational attainment, possibly, but they have whatever they have and a few fee tax things, whatever, and they want to go into the IT sector. Is there a ladder there? Is there potential there? I'm just wondering about that. Could they get jobs at a more programmer level, or at basic? Are there jobs there? Are all the jobs in cloud computing and a way up there in every sense of the word? The payment by results thing is interesting. If you could expand a little on that model, that you'd be that presumably the training units and the educational centres would get payment according to the results, and the risk then is, that they would have equality results as well. Monetary, we might if you might comment on that. In relation to that, I think, as a former teacher myself, obviously, and you identified this point, and I'm getting close to in your presentation, that people should stay obviously for the maximum period in the traditional formal schooling. and that therein lies the key. And the stats on youth unemployment would suggest, as you did it very well there in your first presentation, that you've done the graph of the pyramid is obviously the bulge, and the big numbers, sadly, are among the very low people who have low educational qualifications and have school young. Now, my question is this. What would you think about, we should, and I know that our current Minister Bruton, Richard Bruton, when he was in opposition, had been looking at this question. It's not easy to get the money to do these things in government always, but what do you think about incentives to keep people in school, in actual traditional schooling? If you'd respond to that, because I think we'd be interested in that. And maybe I'd leave it at that.
Thank you, Deputy O'Reilly. And before I call Deputy Birkin, can I just remind members that we are expecting a vote at about 3:15. So, bearing that in mind, can the next speakers limit their contributions to 3 minutes? That would be appreciated. Deputy Bernard.
Sorry, thank you, Chairman. First of all, I want to, like other speakers, congratulate our visitors for their presentation. This is probably the most important presentation we've had in recent times, because youth and youth unemployment is a very important and sensitive issue. Youth are impressed by what they see around them. They have a short time span in terms of determination of what's likely to happen, what has happened, and a short perception of history. So for that reason, I think that Montgomery once said, you know, in the 1950s, he said that Britain in 1939 was capable of fighting the First World War. In 1993 or 94, we were capable of dealing with the unemployment situation in this country that we inherited in the 80s. That was the sad part about it. Dermot Stokes is a fitting example of that. Now, I'm not saying that the hair left his head for that particular reason or anything like that, but my hair changed colour as well in that intervening period. And it's amazing, you know, the lessons that we learned over that huge period of time. We saw the time when graduates came from other European countries and those within the European Union and outside the European Union in the early 90s, seeking job opportunities in this country. And they worked at anything. They grabbed anything that was available, worked as waitresses and all that kind of stuff. And they were laden with degrees. It was just embarrassing at the time. And they were in a great position to fill positions that became available. And we discovered during the 80s that we had to, it was a sticking plaster situation where you assessed every situation, tried to deal with it, moved on to the next one, tried to deal with the next group that were coming on stream, and tried to address the position from the point of view of the person who is unemployed and who had little prospects. I think that the changes that have taken place in the meeting of the market requirements in terms of job skills is a hugely important issue. I think that's the first thing. And all of us have put down questions on this issue over the last number of years, because there's clearly there's a disconnect somewhere along the line that in order to meet the requirements of the market, there should be some relationship with the educational system to find out what do you require. And how soon do you require them? And can we plan for that down the road? And that's what we have to do. We have to do that now. And I know that you're doing that. And congratulations on that. The other one we have to recognise is this, and this is an important one. During the late 90s, very late 90s and 80s, a huge number of young people with great expectations and great ability and capability were in the educational system and left it early, unfortunately, into the marketplace to supply jobs that was a rush on at the present time. Huge salaries available to people with relatively little qualification, but the attraction was there. So how could you say to a young fella or a young girl either that, you know, stay in education for another 3 or 4 years and we'll have a nice job for you? Or there's a prospect here, by the way, some employers offering a job now at a fairly attractive salary, and what are the options? So we now have to ask ourselves, what are the options? And the options, to my mind, are very, very stark and simple. We have to, first of all, encourage the young people in the direction which is their long-term interest. My colleague has already mentioned, 2 colleagues in fact have mentioned, in relation to the outreach schemes. I think that's a conduit that we have to explore to a greater extent. We've been down that road before. We've done all these things before, and we're only now beginning to focus. The government schemes begin to focus on the issues that are up front, up close and personal, and affecting the young people of the country. The other thing that made mention is the immigration thing. And yes, the immigration thing sort of distorts our situation to some extent, because we all know young people who have been in a painful situation where they have the option of remaining on the dole for a long period, maybe even doing odd mixers and being caught. Again, not an option. Or emigrating and trying to do something for themselves and get back a bit of pride and dignity and all that kind of stuff. And it's very, very difficult and heartbreaking to have to deal with those kind of situations from the point of view of parents, from the point of view of the educational system, from the point of view of the youth services that we have and are doing a great job throughout the country, and from the point of view of the individuals themselves. It is utterly heartbreaking to have to deal with that kind of situation. And again, we've dealt with it before. But the thing that I would like, and I would love an opportunity again, Chairman, to have a longer debate on this particular subject. Because this is not a new subject, Matt. This is not new at all. This has happened before, down through history, and will continue to happen. Because for some unknown reason, every generation seems to make a mistake, even though the previous generation has done so, and haven't learned from the lessons of it. And we find ourselves in a position where we try to introduce the original finger in the dike to stop the flow at the time that it happens, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Last point, I have so many last points, Chairman, that I decided, oh yes, I know what one of the points is that group of people who are disaffected throughout Europe, who are disconnected, who are not interested, in. So that group don't see any reason to continue. They don't see the need to continue. And you and I and everybody else, all our people here, deal with people, young people in that particular category. And they have no prospects. They see no prospect. There's nothing there for them. And we need to separate from that group the people who have addictions. I think we need to separate those, because that's a different group of people altogether. I think there's a tendency to encompass them in the same group. The people who are disconnected, disaffected, and the people who have addictions. The people who have addictions need to be dealt with separately. Their addictions have to be addressed. Their problems have to be addressed. They have to be brought on board. They have to be helped to understand their particular situation, and that their addiction is not going to be a particular help to them, and to address that particular issue. The other ones are slightly different. They're disaffected. They have no confidence in the system. Sure, politicians are all a shower of so-and-sos and all this kind of thing. We hear all this on a regular basis. And the system doesn't address the issues of young people. Wrong. A colleague of mine, when I came into this house first, was the late Professor John Kelly. And he once famously said, I feel so sorry for the young people, but they're not the first young generation. We were all that ourselves. I know, looking at the colour of the hair in my head now, Chairman, you probably think I was never a young person, but I actually was. And all these situations presented themselves to us in our time, in our generation, in very difficult circumstances as well, because there were very little options then. Very, very little options. So I just want to say they're just a few of the things, like educational training, not enough places. Why? Why not enough places? Why are there not enough places? I know what the answer is, but I'd like to hear it just again. And the other one, particularly concerned, the most advantaged are those most in need, pushed back to the back of the queue. Well, I've referred to that already, and again I would say, why are they pushed to the back of the queue?
Thanks.
Why don't we deal with it? And I'm sorry, Chairman, I could go on and on forever. Why is it that these things, and yeah. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. I will come back to you again.
Thanks very much. Deputy Eric Byrne.
Yeah, just like Deputy Durkin, one could talk all day on this topic, because it is rather complex, to say the least of it. And I want to welcome the three speakers who are specialists in the field. Unfortunately, you're posing as many questions back to us as we wish to pose to you. Let me put it this way. I understand this new EU, the 6 billion, which is, of course, to be more than welcomed. It would be over a 5-year period, presumably, over the period of the budget, and it will be internationally targeted throughout. And I understand that it will probably be broken down even within wealthier countries to targeted areas of disadvantage. Now, a huge problem we have in Ireland is the class divide, the structural divide between sort of the early school leavers who are social welfare, well, not so much social welfare, but social housing dependent groups. And I note, and I'm asking about the type of structures we should be putting in place. Now, you need a dictionary now. And when I got involved first in the community sector, I had to learn a brand new language. But even for looking and targeting people into employment, at the moment you have Job Bridge, community employment, you have TUS, you have the Jobs Plus, you have the Momentum programme, and I don't even know whether at this stage does CERT even exist anymore. It used to be a training programme for people in the catering industry, and we're into Solace as a new structure. So look, to try and get our head around, my particular interest is in the statistics that you presented us with about particularly targeting the long-term unemployed. Now, the long-term unemployed tend in the main to be early school leavers, but the European job, youth guarantee, I understand only comes into play at the age of 18 to 24. But already you'll have already had a huge catchment. And let's talk geographically. I represent Dublin South Central. I can tell you in Dublin 10 and Dublin 8, you can read the statistics about the degrees of disadvantage that exist there. The disadvantage is comparable to early school leavers, social housing schemes, all the inner city flat complexes. And up in Cherry Archer, Ballyfermot, and Dublin 10, you've got huge statistics to prove disadvantage. Now, I'm wondering, do we need a structure? Because somebody mentioned the need to involve the community and voluntary sector. Do we need a number of new structures to target people? I was a huge fan, and those of us who know the area well, of the urban programme, the EU urban programme that was attached to Ballyfermot, Cherry Orchard. It transformed Cherry Orchard and Ballyfermot. It was the most successful targeted programme to uplift a community, not by way of employment, but by way of the provision of services from creches to preschool facilities and special facility parks and the whole lot, leisure centres. Do you think there's any validity in arguing that specific structures be put in place within regions of Dublin, for example, targeting Dublin 8, as it is targeting with a particular structure,
Deputy, can
Dublin
you move your
10
phone
for
away?
a particular coterie of people?
Deputy, can you move your phone away from the mic?
Have I got a phone on? Sorry about that. And to conclude by saying, it is rather complex, and I think, we would love another, and we might revisit it, because I'm not quite sure how central government is going to draw it down, what criteria they're going to use. But is that a problem that we are building it out of? We are building it up as a solution to a problem that's already been created by the kids who are leaving school before the ages of 18, which are our long term. So look, what would we do, Chairman, without being able to look at our Nordic cousins? The problem is they pay huge taxes, and the people in this country want the services but don't seem to be able to come to terms with the cost of the provision of these services. Yeah, and I'm going to conclude by saying I know intimately the work of Youthreach. It is a phenomenal. Youthreach is a phenomenally successful concept, and the staff who work in it are particularly sort of a staff that's well able to relate to the client base. And just to take a bow that anybody involved in Youthreach, I'm not as familiar with all the other programmes as I am with Youthreach as a former DVC employee. Really, that's it. It's just about the structures, and is it too late, coming too late for that coterie who'll be becoming long-term unemployed, having left school early?
Thank you, Deputy Byrne. Before I ask a response, just one question that I've got that hasn't been covered by the other by my colleagues is in relation to the timescales for this. You mentioned about the need to ramp up, and that you don't think that the sufficient number of schemes are out there at the moment. What is your best guess estimate for how soon a youth guarantee scheme can be up and running in its entirety in the country, bearing in mind the need, A, to ramp up, and B, the issue in relation to funding, and C, possibly the need for some sort of pilot schemes first. So I'd be interested to know your views as to when something will actually kick in for the country. Who would like to go? Now, and just bearing in mind the time, could you limit your comments maybe to about 6-7 minutes each? Probably okay. Be great. Thanks. Anybody in particular order? Do you want to go first, James?
That's okay. Thanks very much for the questions. I just want to clarify I'm not here on behalf of any Nordic governments or anything like that, just in case anyone thinks that I'm here for that.
Didn't bring the money, James.
No, unfortunately not. Well, I'll not go into and there's a lot of Irish and local specific questions that I'll leave to James to address, but just specifically to address Senator Riley's question about the operational level of the Youth Guarantee. I think the first phase is to bite the bullet when it comes to youth unemployment, because it's 24% across the EU officially youth unemployment rates, but young people are much less likely to approach the public employment services as older people. So the first stage is to get a real grip on how many young unemployed people there actually are. In terms of an operational way, what we can see from the way it's been implemented in different countries is one weakness of the Swedish model was that they focused too much solely on jobs. So what happened, unfortunately, was they pushed some people, young people, into jobs that wasn't appropriate for them in terms of the skills mismatch, which already mentioned. That they have worked to address that in Sweden. They knew already from the start when they started implementing it in Finland that this was a problem. So they made sure there was much more of a vocational education and training element to it, much more of an education focus, slightly more long-term approach as well, and it has shown to have had more success, even on the level of uptake among young people that are interested in the scheme. I think one of the big problems in many European countries is, as was mentioned by almost everyone, especially by TD Durkin, was that unfortunately some of the public employment services are operating at a level of maybe 10 or 20 years ago in terms of the labour market. It's a much changed labour market, especially when it comes to young people and the amount of flexibility that they have compared to older workers. To give one example is that in Belgium, where the European Youth Forum is based, so I've slightly more of a look towards the Belgian system. In order to access your social benefits and your dole in Belgium, it takes about between 9 and 12 months is the period as an activation measure before you're eligible to have your benefits. For a lot of young people, it takes such a long time to get their benefits. Once they actually get them, it's very difficult to motivate them, unfortunately, to come off the benefits because it's so difficult to get on it in the first place. And this is just one example of, unfortunately, how some of the schemes aren't in the interests of young people. And the question from Senator Riley on the funding, where the funding come from? Well, the $6 billion that's been earmarked is over a 6-year period. It applies to a region known as NUTS 2, which is it's distributed on a regional basis, which has many advantages because some regions in Europe have a much higher level of youth unemployment than the national average, and it'll go to about 16 member states. €6 billion, I mean, it is an investment and it is to be welcomed for what it is, but certainly in terms of the overall budget, what the European Youth Forum would say is that young people deserve a much bigger investment, specifically when you consider how much money in the long term the Youth Guarantee could save if it's implemented correctly. I mean, to give an example, I was reading in the Irish Times recently that €5 billion of EU funds were misappropriated in 2010 alone. If you compare that with a €6 billion investment over 6 years for a youth guarantee system, it gives you a little bit more of a comparative figure. And just to finish, because there was a lot of questions on vocational education and training, certainly the German and Austrian system have a very developed level of VET, and there's a lot to be learnt there, but also, especially in Germany, they have a labour market that very much lends itself towards vocational education and training, a very highly developed industrial labour market that can really absorb young people that undertake that. But certainly, maybe in the Irish case, there's a lot to be learnt, specifically, as you mentioned, on the IT sector, on getting young people into that sector, as it's so well represented here. And just the final point, do we need new structures? I think, just from learning from other countries, not necessarily to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's a lot of structures already in place which are very good. It's about reorientating them towards the needs of young people and bringing in some measures that young people can believe in, and maybe bringing in youth organisations as a monitoring mechanism as well, to ensure that the youth guarantee schemes that are brought in are always in the interests of the young people that are participating in them. So thanks very much.
Thank you, James.
Yeah, great.